Wow, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. What a great audience we have tonight, don't we, Mr. Real?
They are amazing, Mr. RF Mormon.
What an amazing evening it is, too. And, I think that maybe they finally, down there in Las Vegas, have gotten around to voting on the temple, the city council that's going on today. They were talking about it all afternoon. Oh, my gosh. And I didn't even watch it all. But I was in the live chat a little bit just to spice things up.
Good. How did it seem like things were going?
Oh, the fix is in.
The fix is in.
The fix is in, totally. That's why some of the things I wrote were you really can get anything you want in this world for money. Yeah. It's very obvious. It might be a little bit shorter than they originally proposed on the spire.
Yeah.
14 feet. That makes a difference.
Yeah. It's kind of like when I tell the ladies I'm 6 foot, but I'm only 5'11" and a half.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, there we go. There goes that Vegas temple up and about.
Oh, and do you want to announce this thing that is already being planned? And I think you've got a thumbnail out about it is it August 6th in Texas, relating to a temple there in Fairview or McKinney, depending on what name they're applying to it now. It was the McKinney Temple. We'll see if it remains so.
Yeah, I'll throw that up on the screen here. So we've been working behind the scenes, Radio Free Mormon, myself, and Rebecca Biblioteca, to set up a Mormon newscast on August 6th, 2024. That is when the town council in Texas, McKinney Temple, where that's being designed, it's in Fairview, Texas. And the church came back with some alterations being suggested, dropping the temple height by, I think, 15 feet and renaming the temple, I assume having something closer to do with actual Fairview instead of the next town over.
Yes.
And we will be there. So Rebecca Biblioteca will be on the ground there in Fairview, Texas. RFM and myself will be here in the news studio at the Mormon Newscast, and we will start streaming live that day at 5 p.m. The town council meeting on August 6th of 2024 starts at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And Rebecca, I think, will have some interviews maybe before and certainly after. And we'll watch all of that town council meeting together as a group. And anything else you want to say about that, RFM?
It sounds fantastic. I think it's not quite 15 feet that they're going to shave off. It's a few inches shy of 15 feet.
Yeah.
Too
Several
good a joke to only tell once.
Yeah, you got it, my friend. Sweet. I'll pull that off the screen and take us through what we're talking about tonight.
Yes, we are so blessed tonight. We have not one but three quite eminent scholars in Mormonism, and if we can just bring them all on, that'd be great. We've got Cheryl Bruno, we have Christopher Smith, and we have Don Bradley. Hello, everybody.
Hello. Hi.
Well, this is wonderful. And Cheryl, I want to start with you because you are the editor of a recently released book called Secret Covenants. Could you tell our audience a little bit about that? By the way, we have these two authors, Don and Chris. We're going to talk about a couple of somewhat interlocking papers that one or both of them authored and that are contained in this volume, Secret Covenants. But Cheryl, what is this book about and where can our audience get it?
Hello, I am so excited to be here tonight. I really am so excited. Thank you so much, first of all, for giving us the opportunity to come on your show. We are really thrilled to be here. And here is Secret Covenants. You can get this book on Amazon, or you can get it at your local Benchmark Books. But it is it's available for purchase now, and it is a book that I've edited with about 10 different authors, most of them really well-known scholars in Mormonism, Mormon studies. And so what we're going to be talking about today are two of the essays that are in the Secret Covenants. You'll notice that the subtitle is New Insights on Early Mormon Polygamy. And tonight we're going to talk about a truly new insight that I do not think any of you, if you haven't read the book, have ever heard before. So that's pretty unusual because we've been talking about Mormon polygamy now for many years. So to have a brand new insight is something pretty big, and I call it a bombshell. So what we're going to do is we will start off with just kind of locating in Kirtland the relationship of Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger. And the two of them, Don Bradley has actually narrowed down the date of their relationship to very close about, I don't know, Don, was it within 2 weeks or so?
I think he's got it down to the hour. Isn't that right, Don?
I'm non-muted. Okay, great. I have it down to a period of days when Emma discovered the relationship between Joseph and Fanny, and I'm actually able to suggest a particular day.
Yep. Now, Don, before
Okay.
you go there, oh, I'm sorry, that's where we want to start, but I know that just based on what I've read over the years, and I'm nowhere near the expert on this that all three of you are, but I know that this has been a date that has been elusive, that we know from, it's been like from 1833 to 1836, really, until she left, right?
Right.
And people have come up with different dates on this marriage date, and yet it has a hard and fast date has eluded people, but of course it has theological implications.
Right. So that's what I was gonna talk about. So yes. So this date is really important, and it's been batted back and forth because in April of 1836 is when Elijah appeared in the Kirtland Temple with the sealing keys. So if the relationship happened before that date, you would not have had the sealing keys on the earth. And so there wouldn't have been a possibility that there was a sealing that took place. And if it happened after that date, there would have been more of a possibility that a sealing could have taken place. And so that's why people have a theological argument for this date. And so I think that you'll find that from this time forth, I believe that people will take Don's date as the date because he has made such a strong case for this date that I don't think that really people can contest it after this. So I think we will have a date pinned down after people read this article.
And I certainly want to hear how Don got there, including the shrapnel argument, which I found fascinating as I read it as well. And that's just one thing, but that's a great place to start. There will be more that we'll be talking about. But this is an important point right now. Yes.
So, yes, you'll hear more about the date, but I also want to tell you the second part of the conversation will be about the sealing that took place. And what Don and Chris have theorized is that this sealing between Fanny and Joseph Smith was an adoptive sealing. I have never heard anyone in Mormonism theorize this before. And it is something that you will have to wrap your mind around. You may have to reevaluate some of the things that you've always believed about this. And I certainly did. I had to think about, I had to adjust my thinking in order to even look at this. But I think it's a wonderful theory. And I think it will be hotly debated. And especially after this podcast, I hope more people will know about it and more people will be discussing it and realize just what the implications are for Mormon studies if this theory is viable.
Is there any particular order you want to address these, Cheryl?
Yes, we'll start with the dating. So why don't we go ahead with Don first? I think Don has a few things to say about that.
Hey, Don, do you know what that noise is? I think it's coming from your microphone.
What is the noise?
Well, it kind of sounds like Reagan in The Exorcist after she gets possessed.
Okay. I'm not familiar enough with that scene, actually.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, now it stopped.
It stopped? Okay. No, we're okay.
Just okay. But you're doing great. You're doing great. Okay.
Thanks. So I've got a PowerPoint. Am I good to use that?
As far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
Yeah, you should be able to present a screen there at the bottom, Don.
Okay, let me
So at the very bottom of StreamYard, it'll say present.
Present.
And you can either share a screen if you got a second monitor, or you can share slides if they're on Google Slides.
Okay. Should. Okay. Alrighty. It's getting me to log in here.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to cover for you while you're logging in, but if you want to cover, go ahead. Yeah, so this is a paper, the discovery that you made, correct, Don? And then we're going to go into the adoption stuff, which is a joint paper between Don and Chris. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So that, right. So the material for the second paper about the adoption, Chris, actually, I had asked him to help me give feedback on the initial paper. He then had some further insights that became the nub for the second paper, and then we worked on that together. So the first paper is authored by me, and the second one is co-authored by me and Chris. And it looks like,
That looks rustic.
sorry, I don't see.
So I put your
that it
screen up.
Let me. Oh, so it's showing my screen?
Yeah. So if
Yes.
you're looking at StreamYard,
Oh, okay.
it's taking up
Okay,
most of the
great.
screen.
Okay. Alrighty. Cool. Okay. Sweet. Let's start slideshow here. Okay. So this initial paper is titled Dating Fanny Alger. There's some wordplay here because it's actually about the chronology of the relationship. And so it's subtitled The Chronology and Consequences of a Proto-Polygamous Relationship. So first off, let's start with who was Fanny Alger? Okay, or actually, the family says that the name is pronounced Alger, so I will try to say it that way. She's born 1817. Her family, they're very early converts to the LDS Church in 1830, and she reportedly had lived with Joseph's family for several years before she's kicked out. We have a pretty famous account from Apostle William McClellan, looking very happy here, as you can see. And he says that
Don,
Emma
I'm sorry to
discovered.
interrupt.
Yeah.
Do you mean to have advanced the slide?
Mhm.
Because we're still seeing the original slide, the title slide.
You are?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what you're trying to tell me.
I can move it to the next one for him. Here's the chronology. And who is Fanny Alger?
Oh, and I think he's through that. Now he's probably going to be to McClellan, looking kind of happy. Do you have the next one?
Oh, okay. Let's see
After
here.
that. There I think we're caught up now.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing anywhere where I can move the slides.
Gotcha.
So
If
you
you'll just
can
say
do that
something,
for
I'll
me,
move
I
them.
guess.
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, somebody
See,
moved them.
actually, okay.
Okay.
So I see how to control it now. Okay, we
Sweet.
got it. Okay. So McClellan writes in 1872 letter to Joseph Smith III. Joseph Smith III, Joseph's son, of course, denied a sort of the original, what now would be called polygamy denier, right? He denied that his father practiced polygamy, and William McClellan was trying to set him straight on this. McClellan says that in 1847, he goes and he visits Emma, and we have some contemporaneous documentation of that visit. Then he challenges Joseph Smith III to ask his mother about certain information that the mother had told him.
Ooh.
So McClellan says he'd heard a rumor that he ran by Emma. And he says, again, I told your mother, I heard that one night she missed Joseph and Fanny Alger. She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through a crack and saw the transaction. She told me this story too was verily true. So there's some controversy about this account, right? Whether some people question whether this incident in the barn happened this way, but it's definitely in the early sources. And I actually think this is probably what happened. So then how did Emma react to the discovery? So we have an account from Annalisa Webb Young, whom we'll talk about more later. She says, angered at finding the two persons whom she, Emma, loved, Emma, loved, playing such a treacherous part toward her, she by no means spared her reproaches. And finally, the storm became so furious that Joseph was obliged to send at midnight for Oliver Cowdery, his scribe, to come and endeavor to settle matters between them.
By the way, without going into detail here, I just want to mention that person, Webb Young, who ends up marrying Brigham Young, I think, she is in a really, really good position to report on what happened, or at least what she was told by Fanny Alger. So we don't have to go into all those details, but I just wanted to make it really clear. Because this is the family that Fanny lives with after she gets kicked out of the Smith home for several weeks.
Exactly, right. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here. Emma kicks Fanny out of the house. I'm sorry, it's roasting here. Give me just one sec. I'm going to actually turn the AC back on.
Sure, you go ahead and do that.
Give me one sec. Yeah.
Okay, well, Don's gone. Everybody hide. Just take
I have to
yourself
say
off.
something while Dawn is gone. You know that picture in the very beginning of Joseph Smith? That
Yes.
is a contested picture of Joseph Smith, and I don't feel like anyone should be using that picture of Joseph Smith as Joseph Smith because it's still very contested. And this is my hobby horse, so I have to just make a little.
Do you want to repeat that when Don gets back?
No.
I was going to say, talking dirty about his slides.
We're just talking about you behind your back, Don, but you continue where you were. It's everything fine.
Don may come out with more information about it later, but for now, I would not use it.
And you'll have to
Don't
unmute
use
again,
it in my
Don.
presence.
Okay, Don. Can't hear you that boyish laughter of yours. You're muted, my friend.
So yes, I'm actually writing articles about that daguerreotype, Cheryl. So you'll soon see those. So Fanny gets kicked out of the Smith home. Where does she go afterward? So Annalisa Webb Young says Emma refused decidedly to allow her, Fanny, to remain in her house. But after some consultation, my mother offered to take her until she could be sent to relatives. Her mother was Eliza Jane Churchill Webb. The mother herself wrote in a letter, Fanny Alger had lived in Joseph's family several years, and when she left there, she came and lived with me a few weeks. So Eliza Webb was in an excellent position to know details about Fanny Alger and Joseph Smith because she's actually the woman that Fanny came and stayed with after she's kicked out from Emma's house. And I will give evidence later to further confirm that, in fact, Fanny did go and stay with the Webb family. So a crucial question that we'll ask here, and it will have, as Cheryl said, a lot of big implications. This will seem like a lot of detail, right, about the dating, but it turns out that it has big implications. So when did Emma discover Joseph with Fanny Alger? So evidence from Eliza R. Snow indicates that happened in 1836. So in 1887, Andrew Jensen was doing research on Joseph Smith's plural wives. He spoke with many of the living wives and other people who had information, such as those who performed the ceremonies. Jensen created a list, handwritten list of the wives, and he has Fanny Alger on his list. I was the first researcher really to use Jensen's research notes from this research at the LDS Church Archives. And when I did, I noticed that Jensen's list had not only his own handwriting, but what was clearly the handwriting of someone else looked more like a woman's handwriting. I looked at the accounts from Jensen of who he had spoken to, and among the people he spoke to was Eliza R. Snow. I checked her handwriting against the handwriting on the list and found a match, and then had Eliza's biographer, Jill Durr, look at that handwriting as well and say that she also believed it was Eliza's handwriting. Jensen actually, the reason he puts Fanny Alger on his list of Joseph Smith plural wives is that Eliza R. Snow gave him the name. She wrote it on his list for him. So there we have the list in her handwriting. So he also interviews Eliza after this about Fanny Alger, and he gets information from her. He says, Alger Fanny, Joseph Smith's wife, one of the first wives Joseph married, Emma made such a fuss about, and then he crosses that out. And he says who his source of information is here. Sister E.R. Snow was well acquainted with her as she lived with the prophet at the time. So Eliza R. Snow, people tend to be familiar with the fact that she lives in Joseph Smith's household in Nauvoo in 1842. People are generally less aware that Eliza actually lived with the Smith family in Kirtland twice, once in 1836 and once in 1837. By 1837, Fanny Alger had already moved to Indiana and married a non-Mormon there. And so the only time that could be referred to here when Fanny and Eliza could both have been living in the Smith home would have been spring, summer 1836. So Eliza here in her life story says that for the spring 1836 semester, she boarded with the prophet Joseph's family. We also have an account from Benjamin Winchester, who was in Kirtland at the time, saying that there was scandal about Joseph having, quote, scandalous relations with women in certain families in the early church, and that Joseph, in response to rumors and the buzz about this, he makes a statement in the temple, kind of trying to say that he's, according to Winchester, he says he's above criticism, basically, because he's chosen by God. And then Winchester says this was during the summer of 1836. So here's another indication of time frame. We can narrow, part of what we do here is we create a time window and then we narrow it further and further, right? So we've got Eliza R. Snow indicating spring, summer 1836. We've got Benjamin Winchester saying summer 1836. Fanny Alger herself leaves Kirtland, according to her uncle Levi Hancock, whom we'll get to, around August 31st, 1836. Her uncle takes her with him when he goes west toward Missouri. And so we know that the incident had to have occurred before the end of August 1836. Well, Joseph himself boards a train for the East Coast on July 25th of that year, so over a month earlier, and he doesn't get back until September after Fanny is gone. So the discovery of that relationship had to have occurred before July 25th. How long did Fanny stay with the Webbs? Well, Eliza Webb wrote in 1876 that when Fanny left Joseph's home, she came and stayed with her for a few weeks. So the time period when she was there would have been brief. So if she leaves Kirtland at the end of August, then it was just weeks earlier that she'd been kicked out of the Smith home. So consistent with her leaving before July 25th. Fanny had an uncle, Levi Hancock, who says in his autobiography that Joseph told him, here at the end of this quote, to take Fanny Alger to Missouri, right? So he says that he was working at his trade, wagon making, through the summer of 1836, and he heard that there was a mob in Clay County that had driven the Mormons out, and he received a letter around the same time from his brother Solomon saying he had remarried after his wife had died. So then, and it turns out these are datable events. So I'll get to the dates for these events. So he says he sold his place. He worked on wagon wheels and got a wagon ready by the end of August. So he, like I said, he provides datable events here, right? So he's associating the time when Joseph told him to take Fanny Alger and get her out of town. He's associating that with hearing about his brother Solomon's wedding and hearing the news about the Mormons being mobbed in Clay County. It turns out both those events happened on the same day. They both happened on June 28th, 1836. But news of those events would have reached Levi later. So news of Solomon's wedding, because he was in a different place, would have reached him sometime in July. And we actually know exactly when news about the Clay County, Missouri events reached Kirtland, because we have it in Joseph Smith's journal that news of those events reached Kirtland on July 25th, 1836. That's the same day that Joseph Smith left for the East Coast. So if Joseph leaves town on July 25th, and the discovery of the relationship had to have occurred before that. And it's around the same time that Joseph tells Levi to take Fanny Alger out of town around that same time that news comes. Then he tells him this right around July 25th, 1836. So presumably he's having Levi get Fanny out of town right around the time that, sort of all hell's breaking loose in Kirtland over this. So then in the chapter, as RFM referred to, I compare this, what happens in the Smith home, I compare it to an explosion. And I note that we have multiple people leaving the household. So we've got Joseph taking off from the household. We've got Fanny taking off from the household. While Eliza or Snow is living in the household, if you were a single woman living in a household where there was a blow up like this, that would not be a good place for you to continue to be, particularly if you had a reputation to maintain, like, say, a school teacher like Eliza R. Snow. So she would have had every reason to actually leave the Smith home at this time, and the evidence is that she did. So RFM was referring to in the chapter, I use the analogy of shrapnel, right? So if there's an explosion, even if no one witnesses the explosion, forensic scientists can look and they can see what's sort of the detonation point for that explosion by tracing the pattern of the shrapnel. Where does the shrapnel go? Similarly, we can pinpoint when this sort of domestic explosion occurs based on the various people sort of flying away from the house here. So Eliza R. Snow says she had lived there for the spring semester, which probably goes into summer. She says that when she leaves the Smith home, she goes down to where her parents live down in Mantua, Ohio, to stay with them until 1837. So Eliza had received a deed for property in Kirtland on April 25th. Back in that time, it was really common to hold on to your deed and not record it until you were making a trip to the county seat. And so Eliza herself doesn't record the deed immediately, but she does record it on July 23rd. Okay, so if you look at the map for the time of where the major roads go, if you were going to go from Kirtland, where she's living with the Smiths, down to where her parents live in Mantua, you would take the major road that passes through Chardon or Cardon, however you say it, the county seat. So she deposits her deed there on July 23rd. That suggests that's when she's heading home. And so that shows that Joseph, Fanny, and Eliza are all leaving at basically the same time between July 22nd and July 25th. I would suggest that the discovery of Joseph and Fanny's relationship occurred on the night of July 22nd. Eliza immediately gets out of town, hence the next day she's 10 miles away at the county seat recording her deed when she's on her way home to her parents' place.
Yes, and was that deed given to her by Joseph Smith?
That deed was given to her, I can't remember if it's by Joseph specifically, it's by the church, because she had donated property for the temple, and so the deed was a sort of reward of sorts. I'm not really sure. I have to double check the deed to see exactly who it's from. Yeah. And so why would Fanny have, if Fanny then, we're told, goes and stays with the Webb family, why would she have gone and stayed with the Webb family at that point? So Levi Hancock had a son, Mosiah, who I won't discuss right now. He gives us sort of questionable account of the marriage between Joseph and Fanny that I analyze, critique in the chapter. But he notes that when he was a child in Kirtland, they had a small house with only a kitchen and a single bedroom. And that single bedroom would have housed the parents and 3 children under the age of 5, including a newborn. So where are you going to put Fanny Alger, right? Now, it turns out that Mosiah's autobiography also says that there was a wagon shop across the street from the house, and it was run by some man by the name of Webb. he says one of the men who worked there had the name Pardon. Well, we know exactly who this is. Pardon Webb was the younger brother of Chauncey Webb, the Kirtland wagon maker, the husband of Eliza Webb, whom Fanny goes and stays with. And so now it's making sense, and this tends to confirm Eliza Webb saying, well, Fanny came and stayed with me. Well, sure she did. The Webbs were neighbors to Fanny's uncle, right, the Hancocks. And so, and they did not yet have children. They were well off, so they probably had a larger house than the Hancocks. And there's evidence that Levi Hancock was working at the Webb wagon factory. He was working for them. And so he doesn't have room to house Fanny himself. So he talks to his boss and, Chauncey Webb, and the Webbs agree to take Fanny in.
Don,
So,
can I just break
yeah,
in
go
to
ahead.
observe that only in Mormonism does a kid named Uzziah think that Pardon is a funny name.
Good point. Indeed. So an interesting thing about Eliza Webb is that while we have about 20 accounts of the relationship between Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger, only one person says they talked to Fanny Alger directly and heard from her about the relationship. That person is Eliza Webb. And because we have good evidence that Fanny stayed with Eliza Webb, right, we should take her account seriously. So she says, I did not know that the sealing commenced in Kirtland, but I'm perfectly satisfied that something similar commenced, and my judgment is principally formed from what Fanny Alger told me herself concerning her reasons for leaving Sister Emma. So
Don, when she's talking
Fanny,
about sealing initially, that's just sort of generally when the practice itself commenced within Mormonism by Joseph Smith. That's what she's talking about, right? I don't know that the sealing commenced in Kirtland in a general sense, but she's perfectly satisfied specifically that something similar happened with Fanny Alger.
Right. And we'll get more into this when Chris and I talk about the next chapter. But yeah, she seems to be referring specifically to probably marriage sealing, the question of whether like polygamous marriage sealing began at that time. And she's saying, well, I'm not sure, but something like that started in Kirtland. And I know that because of something that Fanny told me herself. So where does Joseph go? So I mentioned that Joseph leaves town on July 25th to head east. Where did he go? So it turns out he went to Salem, Massachusetts to search for hidden treasure. Okay. Now there's this fantastic story coming out of Kirtland, right? Where Joseph is given this rumor of hidden treasure in a basement in Salem, Massachusetts. And at the drop of a hat, he takes off to New England, 600 miles away, to look for hidden treasure. It's a very strange story, and people connect it with Joseph Smith's treasure searching as a young man. That he had ended 10 years earlier. This is uncharacteristic for Joseph Smith as an adult here, as the leader of a church. And so why would he do that? Well, I would suggest look at the chronology, right? So something you'll hear me say on just about every podcast that I do is much of history is just getting the events in the right order. Once we do that, we see the cause and effect relationships. We can watch the dominoes fall. I would suggest that the Salem treasure trip is, at least in part, a sort of Fanny Alger domino, right? The Fanny Alger relationship is discovered. Joseph is in financial need, so this rumor might appeal to him, but he's also got other reasons to, if you will, get the hell out of Dodge, right? And so he goes to Salem. So Cheryl had talked about that initial reported photograph of Joseph Smith. There's a lot of buzz right now about photographs of Joseph Smith. Do we have photographs of Joseph Smith in Salem? Well, no, actually, that's just me and my wife on our honeymoon in Salem a couple months ago. But we had a great time.
Was that you out there in the ocean? Is that you in the middle picture?
That's me enjoying life. Yeah.
Are you calming the waves?
I am. I'm calming the waves preparatory to walking on water. In fact, that's
Okay.
I won't show that picture for reasons.
You
of
walking on
humility,
water. That's
but
the picture on the right.
Yes. So Joseph, we happen to know, stayed in a house on Union Street. So we went to Union Street. What can I say? We're Mormon history nerds. So he also spoke in Salem and so on. So we were trying to explore, figure out more about Joseph's treasure trip and so on, and just enjoy Salem. So I mentioned that once you put the events in the right order, you can watch the dominoes fall. So once we've pegged when Joseph's relationship with Fanny Alger is discovered, suddenly a lot of other events like the Salem treasure trip become comprehensible. Now we understand why they happened. So in August 1836, Apostle William McClellan leaves the church because he says he had lost confidence in the heads of the church. Now consider, he's one of the 12. When he's referring to the heads of the church, he actually says this to his fellow members of the 12, that he'd lost confidence in the heads of the church. He's not talking about them. He's talking about the people above them who are above the 12, the first presidency. He's lost confidence in the first presidency. And we know, I mentioned right at the beginning that William McClellan says that he in Kirtland heard the rumors about Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger, Emma discovering them in the barn. So now it makes sense why he leaves in August. It was in late July that the relationship was discovered and the rumors about it were spreading. Then John Whitmer, who was then the official church historian at the time of these events, wrote several years later, in the fall of 1836, Joseph Smith, S. Rigdon, other leaders of the church at Kirtland, Ohio, were lifted up in pride and lusted after the forbidden things of God, such as the spiritual wife doctrine, that is a plurality of wives. And so fall 1836, Joseph Smith returns from Salem in September. So the timing that when John Whitmer is hearing about polygamy is right after Joseph Smith gets back from Salem, where he goes, right, to let the dust settle over the Fanny Alger discovery. Another big domino, giant one here, is the formation of the Kirtland Bank, just one of the biggest disasters in the history of the church, right? It caused as much apostasy during Joseph Smith's lifetime as anything else did. And how did this disaster come about? Well, when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and Sidney and Hiram were traveling back east to Salem, they also went to New York City and they talked to people about how do you start a bank? And they got information on that. They came home and Oliver takes the initial steps in starting a bank. They happened to start their bank on the eve of one of the largest financial collapses in U.S. history, the Panic of 1837. And so were it not for the Fanny Alger event, perhaps that would not have happened.
You think Joseph Smith might have seen around that corner?
Maybe.
No response necessary.
So other dominoes here, and RFM, you might have more to say about this because I know you had some interest in this when we talked about it on the phone. So in summer, fall 1837, Oliver Cowdery, we know, is being asked questions by different apostles and other members of the church about the rumors about Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger. And in November of that year, I think it's November 4th, we've got an exact date, Joseph and Oliver talk and they enter into an agreement over a handshake that they won't talk about the subject anymore. But soon thereafter, they both seem to think that the other has broken the agreement. And so it turns out that this is actually it appears to be like the straw or log or whatever that breaks the camel's back of that relationship between them. And Oliver famously writes, so Joseph actually, in December of 1837, he makes a public statement in the Kirtland Temple that seems to throw Oliver under the bus, right? That seems to say that Oliver had lied about him. Two of Oliver's brothers in Kirtland write to him. Oliver's now in Missouri and tell him about this. He is incensed. He writes to Joseph and says, you and I are two, meaning we're no longer one, right? We're splitting up kind of. This is where he famously writes about what he calls a dirty, nasty, filthy scrape of Joseph's and Fanny Alger's, that they had discussed this. And actually, Chris helped me years ago with research on this. People may know that quote as dirty, nasty, filthy affair. The original document at the Huntington Library, the earliest text we have of this, shows that the word affair is written later over the original word scrape, which just is sort of like Webster defines it like a perplexity or distress. It's like a dirty, nasty, filthy mess. So Oliver very clearly thinks that what happened between Joseph and Fanny is dirty, nasty, filthy, which maybe we can talk more about when we talk about the adoption chapter, why he thinks that. And sort of any of this we can talk more about right after the presentation, but just sort of an epilogue to this, fascinatingly, there's an obituary of Fanny Alger, then Fanny Alger Custer, at the time of her death, that I had initially found like 15 years ago. I sat on it too long. It's since been published by David Golding. But in the obituary, it says that Fanny had for some years been a strong and prominent spirit medium. So late in her life, she's no longer a Latter-day Saint. She's becoming a Universalist. She's a spiritualistic medium, right? Communicating with the dead. So she has her own sort of prophetic role, if you will, that she falls into late in her life.
And that will be significant when we're talking later on about the adoptions.
Yeah, totally.
More significant. It is significant already by itself. Yeah, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And this is the...
Can I jump in real quick here? Don, could you real fast before you move on, talk about how this timeline relates to the appearance of Elijah in the Kirtland Temple? Just so
sure. Okay. Right. So if we start with, one of the things we want to know, so what I was looking at in particular here is, when did Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger end, right? And I looked at that first because that's actually the thing for which we have more evidence. But then it raises the question, well, when did the relationship begin? Now here we have the account of Mosiah Hancock, which, like I said, I'm not going to go into in detail. I rip it apart really in the book chapter, right? I show that like Mosiah Hancock is talking about incidents that happened before he was born. There are anachronisms in his account. He says he knows that his account is correct because his memory must be right because he's always lived the word of wisdom, things like this, right? But so if we think about then what evidence do we have about when the relationship started? One thing I would say is we work backward from when we know the relationship ended, right? So Emma Smith in Nauvoo, we know that she is very vigilant about the young women living in the home, right? And so I think it strains credulity to think that this relationship has been going on under her nose in Kirtland for years, right? Emma... so I would suggest that we have reason to think that if the relationship's discovered in late July 1836, probably has not started that long before this. And so then that raises the possibility that it starts after April 3rd, 1836, which is when the Joseph and Oliver are in the Kirtland Temple, and they report seeing the prophet Elijah, who gives them the keys to bind the generations, right? To steal the hearts of the children, turn the hearts of the children to the hearts of the fathers, and the hearts of the fathers to the hearts of the children. Now, and we'll come back to that for the adoption issue, right? And more about the sealing. A few more words about Emma that I should say.
Can I throw something
Emma
in here while I'm
discovers...
thinking about it, Don?
Sorry, yeah.
I agree with you about the years part, and yet I would think that perhaps this relationship may have been going on long enough for Emma to be suspicious. In other words, apparently what she notes is, where's Joseph? And then what she notes is, oh, where's Fanny? And thinking there's a problem. and have to go
Right.
looking for them. So maybe long enough for her. It seems like she's suspicious about it in a way that a person wouldn't normally be unless they had had previous inklings that something might have been going on. What do you think about that?
That does make sense. Yeah. So Emma's experience here is something that needs to be talked about a lot more. So, for instance, when I talk about the data points about the chronology, right, how much of history is getting the events in the right order, Emma had given birth to Frederick Granger William Smith on June 20th, 1836. So almost exactly a month before discovering Joseph and Fanny together, apparently discovering Joseph and Fanny together. So that must have been a particularly jarring discovery, right? And we have a lot of accounts of the Joseph Smith Fanny Alger relationship. Those accounts differ in whether they describe the relationship as polygamy or describe it as adultery, right?
Right.
And that may be partly a difference in vantage point, because if Joseph is understanding himself to be restoring biblical polygamy, and actually think there's evidence that even prior to 1836, this is already being talked about, if not, if there aren't attempts to practice it. So, for instance, there's an article on marriage published in the Doctrine and Covenants in August 1835 that's clearly responding to some kind of incident of polygamy. It says so. It says, inasmuch as this church has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare, and then they give a sort of denial of polygamy.
Right.
But why are they having to give a denial? Something's already happened that has brought reproach on the church, right? So
And
Joseph
prior to this, people have thought that that could have been Fanny Alger.
Right. And I show in the chapter, I lay out several indications. I look at Richard Van Wagner's dating of the discovery of the relationship, where he attempts to place it around the time of that statement, and I show that his four evidences all fall apart, right? So if the Fanny Alger relationship isn't discovered until summer 1836, what in the world was the August 1835 thing responding to, right? So there's already an idea of polygamy, presumably that Joseph himself has, right? But for Emma, she had married Joseph under a monogamous civil wedding vow. So when she encounters her husband in a relationship with another woman, she doesn't experience it as polygamy. She's going to experience this as an affair, right? Particularly if she didn't know about it in advance, maybe particularly in the wake of her having given birth to her and Joseph's child, right? And so we have different vantage points on the incident that then are reflected in the different historical sources, some of which, like John Whitmer, say it was polygamy, and others that say that it was an affair.
Yes, and possibly she goes from believing her husband's denials to the point where she can't believe them anymore because of what she's seen with her own eyes.
Yeah. I mean, that's my presentation on that. So if there's more that you want to talk about it or its implications, I'm happy to.
Can I just?
Or we can.
I just want to ask. I want to make just one comment, which is I think what is really brilliant about putting all of this together is when you start to sit down and go like, how are all of these people connected to each other? How are they family? Are they friends? At what point did this person meet with that person or stay in that person's house? And I really, as I had a chance to sort of go through the document today and our conversation last night, Don, I was really appreciative of how much work you've done to sort out all of those connections and relationships, which I think are instrumental in nudging us to see the sort of most rational way that all of these events sort of came together and happened in the right light. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
It is a brilliant piece.
I think if you read the chapter also, you'll see that it is very brilliant the way he does it, and it is very strong. His argument is very, very strong, and that's where you'll find the sources. And I know a lot of people are saying, so what? But we're going to go on, and we will tell you why this is necessary. It was necessary for you to have this background in order to understand the next part of our presentation. So we're going to go on and have Chris speak to that.
Right. And certainly the significance of it is that apparently it can be reasonably, if not conclusively, dated to after April 3rd, 1836. That is the critical date, right? In the Curtain Temple. And something that was brought up in the second paper, maybe it was, I can't remember which one, but it was emphasized in the second paper, something really significant that had eluded me for some reason. And that's that when Elijah shows up, he's restoring keys that turn the hearts of the children to the fathers and the fathers to the children, not the husbands to the wives. Did you want to start there, Chris?
Yeah, sure. So Don brought me in to help him edit his original paper. And I'll just say, for starters, Bill, I completely agree with you that I thought the coolest contribution of that chronology paper was the recognition that the Webbs were the people who Fanny stayed with when she left Joseph's house, because there's only a very few sources on this Fanny Alger thing. And a number of them seem kind of late and kind of like we don't really know the credibility. And like if you didn't know the Webb's relationship to this situation, you might just be inclined to dismiss those accounts. And I feel like that's what a lot of people have done, what a lot of historians before Don have done, is they've just kind of like dismissed those out of hand or said like, well, we don't really know what happened here because there's just not enough evidence. But when you know who the Webbs are and that they had firsthand knowledge of this, they had talked to Fanny about it, they hosted her after all of this happened, then all of a sudden, like that evidence is so much more credible. And I feel like that, like not only has Don done a wonderful job laying out the chronology of this, but he has like established the evidence that it happened in a way that like it had never been established before. And so I think like pretty revolutionary paper in that. And I think Don even has undersold to you the significance of that work.
Thank you.
So he brought me on to help revise that paper, and he was arguing in an early draft of that paper that there was a marriage sealing ceremony. And I don't always agree with Don on things, but I always take him seriously because he really is an incredibly like detailed historian, always has that attention to detail. So I'm going through this thing, and yeah, like there are a number of sources, and it's these Webbs who talk about sealing in relation to Fanny Alger. There's a couple other sources, you know, the Mosiah Hancock talks about a marriage, and then there's like some trial documents in association with the excommunication that might hint at something like that. But really, it's the Webbs that talk about sealing. And so as I was going over the Webbs statements with kind of a fine-tooth comb, there's one that is fairly explicit that seems to like reference the sealing as an adoption. And with Don's evidence that there was a sealing, I really keyed in on this source. It's the latest of the sources. Okay, it's Anne Eliza Webb Young. And it's like written in the 1870s, I think. And she did not have direct knowledge of the situation. She's like reporting stuff that she learned from Fanny's mother and from her own mother, Eliza Webb. So like you might not pay a lot of attention to this source if you were like not looking for this adoption thing. But I just happened to notice it. She says, Mrs. Smith had an adopted daughter, a very pretty, pleasing young girl. By degrees, it became whispered about that Joseph's love for his adopted daughter was by no means a paternal affection. Although her parents were living, they considered it the highest honor to have their daughter adopted into the prophet's family, and her mother has always claimed that she was sealed to Joseph at that time. So she's pretty emphatic that this was Joseph's adopted daughter, that she had heard this from not only from like her own parents, but from Fanny's parents. And they considered it an honor, right? So she's got like details about this adoption apparently that she's heard, and she seems to conflate it with the sealing, right? She says their daughter was adopted into the prophet's family, and her mother has always claimed that she was sealed to Joseph at that time. So for me, when I read that, I thought, like, we know that in Nauvoo, Joseph had this theology of adoptive sealing, and I wonder if that could have been an adoptive sealing. And I just sort of like threw it in. I mean, like, there's other things that I thought that could make sense of, a couple of other things in the historical record there, but I just sort of like threw that in as a comment in the margins. And I chatted with Don afterward, and he's like, yeah, that's a really interesting idea. And then like 2 or 3 days later, he calls me and he says, Chris, I think you're right, and we've got to write a paper about this. So yeah, it blew up into this whole paper, and I think it has like tons of explanatory power when you really start digging into it. Like all of
Chris,
those. Yeah.
Could I interject real quick?
Yeah.
So this was a brilliant insight that Chris added. So toward the end of the original Dating Fanny Alger paper, I was sort of wrestling with, hey, maybe this new dating of when the relationship ended suggests that actually it could have started after this Elijah thing, and there could have been a sealing. But then I said something like, but there's no evidence that at this time they were already thinking of sealing horizontally, right? Like sealing husband and wife together. The whole Elijah thing is about sealing vertically to the generations. And so then Chris said, well, yeah, maybe that's what was going on, because the webs. So I was seeing a problem where I was torn, and Chris was like, yeah, that relates to this web source that's saying Fanny was adopted. There was a sealing and Fanny was adopted. And so that would make more sense of this. And so, yeah, then after he proposed that, it really did blow up into, we started looking and saw all kinds of additional evidences for this. And as Chris is going to tell you more, all kinds of implications.
Yeah, so like historians have noticed before, right, that marriage and adoption are sort of like weirdly intertwined. Richard Bushman has this thing, which I think like lots of people have regarded as an apologetic, a defense of the church, where he says that like the Nauvoo marriage sealings were really dynastic sealings, that he's trying to like bring, like, adopt men into his family by marrying their wives, you know, or like adopt the parents into into his family by marrying their daughters or whatever. He's trying to like create a dynasty. And Sam Brown has said that the marriage system and the adoption system were developed in tandem, and that proto-polygamy sounded like nothing so much as spousal adoption. And like he's doing adoption and marriage at the same time. But like nobody had really put a fine point on how that was working. So it just seemed to be sort of like hanging out there, like, what is this weird apologetic? It seemed like it was designed more to like defend the church than anything. But there is evidence for that, you know. It's just like nobody knew what to do with that evidence before. And so I think like one great thing that this does is that like we're able to tie all of that evidence together and explain what exactly is going on here, and why these two things are so intertwined. So like the Annalisa Webb Young source is really explicit. That's the one explicit source that says, yes, like there was a sealing and it was an adoption, right? There are multiple other sources that are like suggestive. So I would say there's like maybe sort of 3 tiers of evidence here. The one explicit source, the ones that are sort of like more ambiguous, but that like once you look at them in this light, they like it explains what's going on in those sources, right? And so I would put Annalisa Webb Young's parents' accounts in that category, where like they're talking about sealing, and they seem to be interpreting sealing as marriage sealing, but it's a retrospective interpretation, right? They're speaking from after the Nauvoo period. They're saying there was a sealing in Kirtland, and like that's where plural marriage began, was in Kirtland. But they're interpreting it through the lens of everything that they knew about Joseph's like sexual relationship with Fanny, and also everything that they knew about like Nauvoo polygamy. But like when you look at the some things that Chauncey Webb said about Nauvoo polygamy, he kept keying in on the fact that multiple women that Joseph married polygamously in Nauvoo were also adopted daughters of Joseph Smith, that they, like, before being wives, they had been adopted daughters of Joseph Smith. Well, why is Chauncey Webb keying in on that detail like over and over and over again in his accounts of Nauvoo polygamy? I think it's because he already had in his mind that like this had happened before in Kirtland. And so he's like interpreting all of this stuff that happened with these women in Nauvoo through the lens of what he knew of Fanny Alger in Kirtland. And so I think that like the fact that he's so interested in the issue of adoptive daughters becoming plural wives in Nauvoo, like for me, that underscores that, yes, he knew something about Fanny being an adoptive daughter in Kirtland.
Right. And that's one of the strengths, I think, or at least supporting evidences of your theory here, is that this would not be unique. If
right.
he
Yeah. No,
had
there's
adopted Fanny Alger as his adoptive daughter and then move that into more of a husband-wife kind of relationship, because there are other historical precedents for that, right? Lucy Walker, is that one?
Yes, Lucy Walker is one of them. There's like, I mean, Sarah and Maria Lawrence, the Partridge sisters. So there's at least 5, and there's several others that like Webb implies were adoptive daughters, and we don't have any other evidence that they considered themselves adoptive daughters, but maybe Webb was right. So there like as many as possibly 8, I think, is what I counted. I actually have an essay in the same volume on Joseph Smith's plural marriage proposals, in which I tally all of these marriages to adoptive daughters in Nauvoo, and sort of talk about the evidence for which ones were daughters and which ones may have just been like domestic workers who lived in the house. And definitely there was some slipperiness between those two categories, right? Like domestic workers would in some sense see themselves as adoptive wards of the family, but like because they're not like actual biological children, they still sort of are expected to do domestic work around the house. So you definitely could like dispute or debate like exactly to what extent these people were integrated into the family as adoptive children versus being just sort of like symbolically or ritually adopted.
Chris, one thing I want to make clear, because I've had this question asked, which is when we are talking and when you're talking about adoption, you're not talking about legal adoption through the courts, because that wasn't even a thing yet, was it? Was it 1851?
Yeah, you're right. I don't know the year, but it was not a thing yet. Yeah, it's
so they didn't go to court and go through the process of having a guardian ad litem appointed and going out and doing a home visit and all that stuff.
The first U.S. laws creating what we now know of as civil adoption were in the 1850s.
Yes.
So at that time, civil adoption didn't exist, and the nature of the adoption that we're talking about here with Fanny Alger shouldn't be confused with either legal adoption or even with familial adoption in the general sense that we know of it now. Fanny's parents were both living. They were both members of the church. Right. Fanny herself in 1836 is 18 years old. So she's not needing to be raised as a child.
Right.
So in her case, an adoption would have been like the later law of adoption in Mormonism. It would have been a ceremonial adoption with spiritual significance. But there was apparently in tandem with Joseph's adoption of Fanny Alger, another ritual adoption by Oliver Cowdery that actually did also appear to include a familial adoption. Do you want to talk, Chris, about Adeline Fuller?
Yes, because I was going to ask you the question, which will lead into that, which is this idea about an adoption or an adoptive relationship between Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger, and that becoming intimate. Was there anybody in church history who had a problem with that?
Yeah, so yeah, definitely Oliver Cowdery had a problem with that.
Yeah,
And but before I get to that, let me just say, like, I think because adoption law did not exist yet, I do think that there's a familial dimension to these adoptions into the Smith family, including Fanny. But like, it's also informal, you know, and these are like adults who are being adopted into the family. And so, like, yes, they're being adopted as daughters, like people are talking about them as daughters, but really they're being adopted as family members, you know? And so I think it's like more nebulous than thinking of them as like father-daughter, because like really they're peers. They're not that far apart in age. And
How
like,
old was Joseph Smith when Fanny was 18?
John,
30.
Don, okay, 30, yeah. So
30.
like he's not quite old enough to be an actual like biological daughter, right? So you know, like,
can I just jump in real quick before,
yeah,
because I'm excited for Chris to get into Adeline Fuller, but I do want to just say that in the book there is quite an interesting section talking about the developing theology of adoption, because that is really, really important to this, and we don't have time to cover it here, but I think they've done a really great job at talking about what adoption was in Christianity and how it developed in the Mormon church. So that was one of my favorite parts of the article.
yeah. I hope that we do get to talk about that at least for like a couple minutes, but yeah. So like before I talk about the Oliver Cowdery thing, let me just like say there are like 3 other sources here that this helps us explain. There's a Fanny Brewer talks about Fanny being an orphan girl residing in the family, which I think like that implies some knowledge of an adoptive relationship. Clark Braden has this weird story that nobody has ever known what to do with, where he says that there was an adopted daughter that Joseph like had sex with in Kirtland. He's speaking like in the 1880s or 1890s, like based on old reminiscences from residents of Kirtland. And he says that the adoptive daughter was Julia Murdoch Smith, who was like, you know, she was like 3 years old at the time. So like, there's no way that that's who.
So this is scandalous, what you're telling us tonight.
Sorry, what?
Nothing. I say,
okay.
so this is scandalous.
If that were true, it would certainly be scandalous. But no, there's no way that's who this adopted daughter was that Joseph Smith supposedly had a relationship with. But like, if you know that Fanny's an adoptive daughter, then all of a sudden you can go, oh, he actually was talking about Fanny Alger. She was the adoptive daughter that there was a sexual relationship with, right? So so this like hypothesis all of a sudden helps us make sense of all of these reminiscences. Also, the Mosiah Hancock, I think more highly of that account than Don does, partly because I think Don first encountered it as a source about a marriage ceremony, and I was thinking about it in terms of an adoptive ceremony. Mosiah Hancock describes how his dad was going to perform Joseph got his dad to go to Fanny's parents to get permission for the sealing. And like Levi Hancock went to Fanny's parents and they were like, oh yeah, that's fine. You know, like no big deal.
It's fine with me. Go ask her mom. So he goes to the mom.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And the mom's like, yeah, it's cool with me.
Yeah.
And so like that obviously wouldn't make sense if this were a plural marriage. But like it makes total sense if it were an adoptive sealing. So I think there actually probably is some truth to that account. And I think that probably Joseph did have like permission to do, like did seek permission, and like those sources are describing something that really happened.
I think we have the web saying that the parents gave consent.
Yeah, that Eliza.
Well, and so
yep.
Yeah, I think that I actually do see the Mosiah Hancock account as having value. I just don't think that it's really describing an 1833 marriage. As
oh no, yeah, the dates are wrong, the details are wrong. Yeah.
And to make this clear, Chris, when you're talking about a ceiling, because we're looking at it pretty much from the same perspective as people in the 1870s, which is we hear ceiling, we think marriage, whereas perhaps, and what you're arguing is that the ceiling being referred to, originally at least, between Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger, was a ceiling of adoption.
Yes, yes. And that's where maybe I'll pivot to talking about Oliver Cowdery. So as Don mentioned, the temple ceremony, the temple dedication has this Elijah appearance, and they're talking about turning the hearts of the fathers to the children. And as Cheryl mentioned, there's this long history of like adoptive theology that Joseph Smith is building up. And it has to do with like the right to priesthood. He's always talking about like, you need to inherit through your parents from like Abraham and Aaron, the right to priesthood, which like is not really part of Mormon priesthood theology today. But like in Kirtland, Joseph is obsessed with this idea that like priesthood is like genetically inherited
It's
from
patriarchal.
Abraham and Aaron. What's that?
It's patriarchal.
Yes, absolutely. That word patriarchal really meant something in Kirtland. Like that was not a metaphor. And the whole like doctrine of patriarchal blessings and everything like grows out of this. But like, so I think Joseph is thinking, and he's particularly thinking about people who have no living parents that they could be sealed to, and also people who have like apostate parents. Like, what do you do with those people? And so like all of those people under the patriarchal theology, like they sort of get adopted to the church patriarch. And that's sort of part of the like patriarchal blessing theology, is like they're all sort of like he's standing in as a substitute parent for those people who don't have living parents in the church, and he's gonna like give them blessings so that they can inherit the right of the priesthood. Well, I think that like it's all like none of it is systematized, but I think that 1836, this temple dedication, may be a first attempt to systematize some of that, and he's going to introduce like a sealing ritual that is going to like start to formalize some of that. And maybe
any indications of whether the adoption was its own ritual?
Say
Are
that
there
again.
any indications that the adoption had its own ritual?
So not like we don't. If there was a ritual, we don't know what it was. But like I think there was a ritual. I just think that like the sources aren't there to tell us what that ritual was.
So
I think
actually,
in the future you're going to be seeing some more on that from Don, because he's working on that.
I have a partially complete further paper. So this research that we did resulted in these 2 chapters for Cheryl's book, but there was actually a third paper that grew out of that, where I've been pursuing evidence about the exact nature of the adoption ritual used and what the roots of that ritual were, and how there may even be echoes of that ritual in later statements that are attributed to Fanny Alger and so on. And so I would argue that actually, I will ultimately argue that we do know more about the ritual used, and that it has significance in understanding the development of Mormon temple theology.
Okay, so that is a yes from you, a big yes, that there was a ritual associated with the adoption sealing.
Yeah, and I think what we know about the ritual there in Kirtland is that Joseph and Oliver did it together. And so let's talk about that. Brigham Young and the like excommunication records for Oliver Cowdery like indicate that around the same time that Joseph was in trouble with Fanny, Oliver was also in trouble with a girl who was adopted into his family and lived with his family in Kirtland. And like there's even a suggestion by Brigham Young that like Oliver married somebody in a plural marriage ceremony, which like makes no sense, because Oliver is so mad about the Fanny situation. Like, why would he be entering into polygamy if he regards this as adultery and considers it all like scandalous? It makes no sense for
dirty, nasty, filthy, to use those words.
Right? It makes no sense for Cowdery.
Unless it's a compelled virtue.
a compelled virtue. What does that mean?
Well, he can't exactly say, I'm okay with it. And once it comes out that Joseph Smith has been caught doing this, he has to be against it publicly.
But he's the instigator of all of this. Like, nobody else is prosecuting this case, really. It's Cowdery and his brother who are prosecuting this case in Kirtland and making a big deal out of it, you know?
Okay.
So, like, they're the ones who break the scandal. And so, like, it makes no sense for Cowdery to be a polygamist, but like, those sources do reference a girl being adopted. So I think basically what's happening at the excommunication hearing is that people are remembering the sealing ceremony where Joseph and Oliver seal each other to these adopted daughters. And in the same way that Joseph has interpreted his own adoption sealing as a marriage, they are sort of like doing the same rhetorical move to like smear Oliver with the same accusation, even though like that's not an interpretation that Oliver would have agreed with of that sealing, but they're using it rhetorically to smear him along with Joseph and make it look like he's guilty of the same thing.
So for the record, I would agree completely with Chris. Oliver Cowdery was an opponent of polygamy. We have him, I argue in the Dating Fanny Alger chapter that actually the Fanny Alger incident is maybe the key reason why Joseph and Oliver's relationship falls apart. Oliver is angry about it. And then we have a statement when Oliver is coming back to the church after Joseph Smith dies, he hears the rumors about polygamy. And what he says is, I can't believe that the church leaders would approve of this. He's clearly against polygamy himself. And if you think about, like, why is he so upset about Joseph's relationship with Fanny Alger? And Chris, maybe this is part of where, well, do you want to say a little bit more about Adeline first?
So Adeline Fuller, I did a whole bunch of research on Adeline Fuller, who is the young woman who Oliver adopted into his family. She's the only young woman known to have lived with Oliver's family. And so like, she's really the only candidate to be this person who he is accused of having been involved with. She was 10 years old at the time. So like, there's no way that this was a sexual relationship. Basically,
is she an orphan?
She was an orphan, yes.
So she was a legitimate orphan.
Her father was deceased, which at the time, there were two definitions of orphan. It could be if both your parents were deceased, or if your father was deceased. Her mother appears to have been living, but not taking care of her.
Yeah, so like her genealogy is really, I spent a lot of time trying to like nail down her genealogy. It does seem that her mother was alive. And
she might have been related to Oliver. Her last name was Fuller. That was the surname of Oliver's own mother. So it's possible she's some sort of cousin, right? And that's part of how Oliver ends up adopting her.
Right, but like I couldn't narrow down a lot about her genealogy or where she came from or how she entered Oliver's life. Unfortunately, like most of those details are lost to history, and so I would invite any like genealogist who wants to dive into this and like help solve this problem to engage with this, because I didn't get out to the Midwest where she ended up and like look at all of the records, the physical records that might be there. So there's still lots of work to do that could be done on Adeline.
Are you saying these adoptions were done at the same time?
Yes, they seem to have been. It seems to have been Oliver. Oliver is said to have sealed Joseph to Fanny and performed the marriage ceremony, which again, that's a weird.
Oh, sorry. The source says marriage.
Sorry, what?
The source says marriage.
Yes. Right. The sources indicate that Oliver performed the sealing ceremony between Joseph and Fanny. The sources are interpreting that as a marriage, which that makes no sense with Oliver being like so scandalized by the relationship, you know, unless the relationship was something different when it started than where it ended up. Right. And so that's another way in which this hypothesis makes sense of sources that like don't make sense without this hypothesis, right?
Right. For a long time, I just dismissed the sources that said Oliver. So So reportedly, I believe it's Eliza Jane Webb who says that Fanny's mother said that Oliver Cowdery sealed Fanny to Joseph Smith in 1835 or 1836. Well, that just baffled me for a long time because Oliver was so clearly against polygamy. He was so clearly incensed about what had happened between Joseph and Fanny. How could he have been the guy who performed the sealing? How could her own mother, have thought he was the guy who performed the sealing? So there are anomalies in the data, and these anomalies are explained by the adoption model that Chris and I are putting forward in this chapter.
Right. And so Oliver Cowdery could have been fine with the adoption, and he has adopted his own adoptive daughter. He's fine with the adoption, but where he gets incensed isn't over the adoptive relationship. It's when Joseph Smith takes that to an intimate relationship with his adoptive daughter. Is that correct?
Well,
yes.
In fact, I think that maybe this really helps explain why Oliver is so upset about this, is because if Joseph and Oliver sealed these adopted daughters to one another, and then Joseph's relationship with Fanny becomes something very different from that Oliver cannot approve of, that then makes Oliver feel that he's being made complicit in this thing that he can't approve of. And he's probably also seeing a parallel between Joseph and himself. Joseph had adopted an 18-year-old. Oliver had adopted a 10-year-old. For Oliver, of course, it's going to be unthinkable to have some sort of further relationship with his richly adopted daughter, right? Because he actually raises her. This is a child. When he sees Joseph transforming this adoptive relationship into a different sort of relationship, then he is repulsed by this, and so his very strident statement, right, like about this is dirty, nasty, filthy, and so on, I think becomes more understandable in this context.
Very good.
Right. So let me just jump into, I hope that Don's explanation has made that make sense, because I think it was, the audience wasn't quite understanding that we were saying that both men were adopted at the same time, but Joseph's relationship later became sexual with Fanny. And that was something that Oliver could not agree to. So I think Don explained that very well. And some people are asking for sources on that, which the sources are laid out quite neatly in the chapter. So if you want the sources, they are available to you in this book.
And there are a lot of them. I will vouch for that.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think this helps make sense of is, there are multiple things, and Chris and I can both talk about some of these here. But in the traditional, let's call it, view of Joseph Smith's use of this sealing power of Elijah, right, that's attributed to the Elijah visitation at the Kirtland Temple on April 30, 1836, Joseph doesn't use that sealing power until several years later. So people will point to 1841 with the introduction of Nauvoo polygamy as the first time the sealing power is used. Well, yeah, that's 5 years, okay? So recall the context. In the Kirtland Temple, Elijah, they say, quotes Malachi, saying that he's come to bring these keys to turn the hearts of the children to the fathers and the hearts of the fathers to the children, so that the whole earth will not be smitten with a curse. So basically, it's like Joseph and Oliver are being given power to save the world, right? To save the world from a curse. The context here is apocalyptic. They're fulfilling a apocalyptic prophecy. So if you're given power, right, like RFM, right, to save the world, are you going to be like, maybe someday I should use that power? I'll just sit on it for years, right? That the context doesn't make any sense.
I've been known to procrastinate like that.
Yeah, I'll procrastinate in saving the world, right? And also, what they say, this passage that Elijah is reported to have quoted, right, from Malachi, it's about the binding of generations, right? The turning of the hearts of the fathers to the children, children to the fathers, not husband to wife, right? And so why there are things that just don't make sense in the traditional narrative that, oh yeah, they're given this power on April 3rd, 1836. They wait several years to use it. And when they first use it, they're using it in ways that are very different from what's laid out when the power is given. That they're not using it for like these vertical sealings of the generations. They're just using it for the horizontal sealings of couples. That doesn't make sense. So this makes much more sense.
In fact, I think that essentially what our paper has done, and I would encourage people to read my other paper in the volume too, because I think like it lays out a little bit more like what I see sort of the origins of like polygamy theology being. But I think like we have explained to a great degree where polygamy comes from. And it originates in this like adoptive sealing theology, and like polygamy is almost like a transformation of like Joseph Smith asked for the right to like marry people polygamy or plurally, and then he believes that God has given him that right, and so he uses a lot of permissive language about, oh, this is a privilege that I've been given. But then he later claims that like when God gives you a privilege, it becomes binding. It becomes a commandment. And so you can't refuse a privilege once you've asked for it and been granted it.
Like
and
the
so
or it becomes a
right?
curse.
Yeah, or it becomes a curse. And so like really sealing is given for the purpose of this ritual adoption. Joseph Smith then turns it into a privilege by asking for the right to use it for this other purpose, to marry people plurally. And then it like takes on the force of a commandment because he has been granted the privilege. And so I actually think that like that really is like the origin of plural marriage theology. It's not something that like God delivers as a revelation out of the blue. It's something that Joseph Smith develops through this kind of a reappropriation of the adoptive sealing power that he's been given.
Yeah. Also, Chris, it has a great deal of explanatory power for Brigham's later law of adoption. So if you could speak to that just real quick, I think that's important.
Yeah, so Brigham Young was one of the like very few people who seems to have been in the know about this this adoptive sealing. And he later in Nauvoo has this like lays out after Joseph Smith dies, like this whole theology of adoption, which like seems out of keeping with what Joseph Smith was doing in Nauvoo. When Joseph Smith talks about adoption in Nauvoo, he's usually talking about sealing biological parents to their biological children. And so lots of historians have just said, well, Brigham Young, when he introduces the idea that you're going to adopt people to church leaders, he's getting it wrong. He's just misinterpreting what Joseph Smith was doing in Nauvoo. But I actually think that Brigham Young, because he knew about the situation with Fanny Alger, like that adoptive theology that he develops where people are being adopted to church leaders is actually growing directly out of what he knew about the Fanny Alger episode. He knew that like these two girls had been adopted to Joseph and Oliver in order to obtain like blessings of the priesthood through them. And like that to him like implies this whole framework where like everybody needs to be adopted to the church leaders in order to gain access to their priesthood lineage. So yeah, you're right. And we in the last section of the paper, we go into like some detail on that point, and I won't belabor the issue here, but yeah.
Brigham was around in Kirtland when the after the blow up over this had occurred, and he's actually, we lay out sources showing that he's really like a key defender of Joseph Smith during all the subsequent ruckus, right, over the discovery of Joseph's relationship with Fanny Alger. So much so that Joseph sends Heber C. Kimball on a mission. He was going to send Brigham on a mission, but then decides, no, he needs Brigham to stay with him to defend him. And so Brigham should have known more about the situation. And yeah, I think that would have been a kind of seed for the law of adoption. To what Chris was saying a little bit earlier about like adoption and marriage sealing, I think that Joseph adopting an attractive 18-year-old who was living in his house, and then the whole idea is that they're going to fulfill a prophecy about the turning of the heart. The whole idea there, it's pretty intimate, right? If you are, in order to fulfill this prophecy, Joseph and Fanny's hearts are supposed to be turned to each other. That, I think, kind of leads naturally toward something romantic, right? And so the initial idea of like an adoptive sealing then can easily give rise to, and the people, that was a motorcycle going by. The initial idea of an adoptive sealing can then help give rise to the idea of a marriage sealing. I actually suspect, and I'll explore this in the future paper that I'm going to do, that there are two possibilities about what happens with respect to Joseph and Fanny and sealing, right? One is that the adoptive sealing, the concept, like Chris said, is just so broad, and we see evidence of this that we lay out in Nauvoo, that the idea is actually so broad that it encompasses different forms of family relationships, such that Sam Brown, Todd Compton, and others had observed that there was a real overlap in Nauvoo between marriage sealings and adoption. One possibility, right, is just this initial April 1836 adoptive sealing of Fanny Alger and Joseph Smith is the only sealing between them, and then it just, the form of relationship that's been established is somewhat fluid, right? Another possibility is that there is a sort of second sealing that goes along with the idea of Fanny having a new type of relationship with Joseph Smith rather than just like ritually adopted daughter, then wife. And I'll explore that possibility in this future paper.
You said the April 1836 adoption. Do you have it pegged to April now?
So the sealing power behind it was given on April 3rd. I actually think that, I mean, it's conjectural, right? But I actually do think that I have evidence for a date in April for the actual adoptive sealings of Fanny Alger and Adeline Fuller.
So
Okay,
I
so I'm
just want
guessing
to
it's
talk
between
about.
1 and 31.
I just want to.
Well, April
30,
doesn't have a 31, so yeah.
Okay,
they-
so we're narrowing it down already.
I actually think it was April 6th, 1836.
Do you really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
And that'll I'll talk about that in the future paper.
That being a significant date, it would kind of make sense for Joseph to do major restorations on that day.
A Wednesday? Was that a Wednesday? I think it was a Wednesday, wasn't it?
who knows?
Well, the 3rd was a Sunday, correct?
Oh yes, yeah, it was. It was actually Easter Sunday.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, so if you make any closing comments you want at this point, and then we'll seal off this part, and then we'll invite listeners to call in. We usually have around 3 calls that we allow in with questions from listeners, and they can be directed to anybody who's on the panel, but hopefully to our guests.
Yeah, I'll just I'll conclude with one last little anecdote about Adeline Fuller, which is that we have a bunch of sources that say that she lived with David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery's brother-in-law, for a little while during all of this like Kirtland controversy. And she had a seer stone, and she was receiving revelations, which is really interesting in light of Fanny Alger also having been a spiritualist, receiving communications from the spirit world later in life. It suggests that maybe they were the reason that they were selected for this honor to be adopted ritually to Joseph and Oliver was because they were seeresses in their own right.
Yeah.
So, and that may have also contributed, I think, to the intimacy between Joseph and Fanny. If they both, were revelators, they may have felt a bond over that.
So it has nothing to do with her being attractive.
I think it had a lot to do with that, but
is it also
Many people
possible?
said she was attractive. I just want to throw it into that. An interesting part to me was, well, people are very disturbed by the fact that this relationship became intimate, and it's a disturbing thought. And in the chapter, these authors talk about the lines becoming blurred between adoption and marriage, and then that has later implications for Nauvoo. But there's a line that says, perhaps more than paternal or marital, we should think of Smith's relationship to Alger and Cowdery's to Fuller as esoteric. And I love that. That is, to me, a real powerful way to look at it. I love esotericism in early Mormonism, and I think that Joseph was fascinated by it. Of course, we can tell from the very beginning of his life that he was interested in the esoteric aspect of religion. And so to look at this sealing as esoteric really helps us to make sense of where he's going with it.
Can I also just jump,
Cheryl? I'm so sorry, because I read that line and I was impressed by it too. But now that you're saying it, I'm sitting here thinking, does the word esotericism to describe it, does it actually occlude more than it explains? What do you think? How does it explain it, do you think?
I mean, it does occlude, but I think that to some extent, Joseph Smith sort of wanted things occluded, right? I mean, like Joseph Smith, it's so Joseph Smith for him to like use a word in one context and then change its meaning and like come up with a whole new like theological definition for it that like completely recontextualizes it, but he's still using the same word. Eternal damnation is one example, but like keys, he first uses keys for seer stones,
right?
And then like later they're like priesthood keys, so and like he does that sort of thing all the time.
And sealing, like sealing up entire congregations to eternal life. Wasn't that the original meaning?
So that's, for me, that was difficult when I first read the paper to change my idea of sealing as being being along a continuum, because I thought of sealing as just one thing. But to read this paper and to see that was very enlightening to me. And after I did change my mindset, it really makes a lot more sense.
Well, and it's not just adoption. I mean, the first sealings he was sealing whole congregations to himself. And the idea basically was like, he had a guarantee of salvation. He had received a revelation that he was going to heaven. And so the idea is like anybody he seals to himself is also guaranteed salvation. So he's trying, like, that seems to be sort of the fundamental motivation behind sealing all the way through, is to like bind people to himself so that they can come to heaven with him. But like the meaning sort of that and the form that it took, I think changed fairly radically over the course of his lifetime.
Can I add just one thing here, which is just sort of the pushback on the other side of it? Lucy Walker, which you guys mentioned earlier, is a great example, where in her own record, she makes mention that Joseph Smith introduced, and his wife, she says Joseph and his wife introduced me in public as their daughter.
Right.
And so at least on the other side of the coin there is some data points that point to something less than esoteric, or something less than the way we're sort of making room for it too, right?
Yeah, and that's actually why I disagreed a little bit with Don earlier, where I said I think there was something familial about it. But like, even in the case of Lucy Walker, like, she's as much a domestic servant as she is a daughter. And so like, yes, they may have been using that familial language, but also like there are certainly other dimensions to those relationships. And I don't think it's like son-daughter relationships in quite the same way that we would think of today. Like, you have to put yourself a little bit into a different world where those relationships were like, your children are as much labor as they are intimate family members, those relationships had a different quality then, I think.
Do you think it would be fair to say that, let's just say Fanny Alger was more a daughter to Joseph Smith and more a servant to Emma?
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah. I mean, like, there's no evidence that Emma participated in any like adoptive ceremony, right? So that relationship very probably did have a different quality for her. But I think part of the reason that Emma felt so betrayed by all of these situations is because she did like feel that these people were members of their family, and so she felt betrayed when she found them married to Joseph, you know.
Yeah, the account, the Annalisa Webb Young account, where she's getting her information from her mother, Eliza Jane Webb, right? Annalisa was not born until after these events occurred, but her mother, right, is the one that Fanny stayed with, is providing information. She actually does refer to Fanny having been an adopted daughter of Emma as well, and says Emma felt betrayed. You know, this is part of why Emma felt betrayed. Absolutely, there are like ethical issues, ethical problems that come up with this, right? All of it. And so,
and we explicitly acknowledge that in the paper.
We acknowledge that fully in the paper. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do we have anybody on the phone line, Bill?
Yeah, let me go to that now. Let's see here. So I believe we've got a call, Jack. By the way, the phone lines are open, folks. There's only one caller in there. So if a couple others of you would like to make a call in, the number is 662-667-6667 or 662 Mormons. Let me unmute it and let's see if this picks up. So I believe this is Jack. Jack, are you there? Give me a second. Let's try that. Okay, go ahead, my friend. You're on Mormonism Live. Ooh, we're running into the same thing we did before. All right, go ahead, Jack.
Hey, Bill, can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. I had a couple of questions. Don, considering the era, is it true that Victorian morality was sort of how sexuality was viewed in Joseph Smith's day? Is that an accurate way to look at it?
So you were breaking up just a little bit. I think you asked, was in Joseph Smith's day, was it Victorian morality? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, technically no, because the Victorian era is counted from the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria, which, if I'm understanding, as I recall, begins after Joseph Smith's time.
1837.
Was it 1837 that it's counted from?
Yeah. Well,
really?
That was her coronation, I think. Yeah.
Was it? Okay. My understanding was that it started later. We could look that up, but yeah, I don't know.
Since Queen Victoria's accession.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like that was more also. I don't think that the United States was as prudish as Great Britain was at the time, and actually, like this, I looked into, because there's the source that says that Emma spied Joseph and Fanny together on the haymow. And so I did a little research into the phrase rolling in the hay. And this is actually almost exactly the time that the phrase rolling in the hay comes into popularity as a sexual euphemism in the United States of America.
Really?
Yeah. So I thought that was quite interesting in light of that source that talks about them being found together on the haymow. But like, you know, people definitely are having sex. That I did a lot of genealogical research on another Mormon named Jonathan Dunham during this period. And when I was looking into his whole like family and people, you know, relatives and everything, like everybody is having children out of wedlock. Like it's everywhere. So I really don't think that it was that prudish an era in the United States at the time.
And there were a lot of experimental communities going on, including the Cochranites, right?
Yeah.
By the way,
many of them sexually experimenting.
Right.
Chris Smith gets the gold star today. On William IV's death in 1837, Queen Victoria. Victoria becomes queen at the age of 18.
Hey, just a note there. So I hung up with Jack because the phone lines aren't quite working right. But he had another question too, which is, why do we trust? I'm trying to remember who it was he was talking of. Oh my goodness. It was Chris, he wanted the question towards you. It was a late recollection from either the mother, I think, where the mother says it was a ceiling. And his point was, in a Victorian era, wanting to keep your kids out of sort of a scandalous reputation, why do we trust the mom to be describing it as a ceiling when that would be the obvious thing that maybe a mother would do to protect the reputation of her daughter?
Wow, that's a good question.
I mean, I suppose that's a fair point. When I read that source, I don't see that. Like, it doesn't read to me like that's what she's doing, but I suppose like that's a possibility. I just think, like, given everything else that we've assembled here, like, I don't think that's what's going on. You know, I think it really wasn't an option.
Right. So when when Eliza Jane Webb says that Fanny's mother had referred to the ceiling, if that's all we had, calling it a ceiling, that might be one thing. We also have Eliza Jane Webb herself saying, as I read earlier, I did not know that the ceiling commenced in Kirtland, but I am convinced that something similar commenced, and my judgment is formed principally from what Fanny Alger herself told me. And so at the time that she says this, Eliza Jane Webb had left the LDS Church. Her daughter had been married to Brigham Young, had a terrible polygamous marriage to Brigham Young. She wrote an expose, about that marriage, about Brigham, about the church. These were not people who had any reason to be apologetic toward Mormonism at all. In fact, quite the opposite. And so the fact that she's saying, well, I'm convinced from what Fanny told me that there was either ceiling or something like it, that's evidence that would weigh, and it would have the opposite bias, if anything, from what the caller is suggesting for the mother's statement, Fanny's mother's statement.
And when Eliza Webb Young reports the mother's statement, she's reporting it alongside the observation that by degrees it became whispered about that Joseph's love for his adopted daughter was not paternal affection, right? So Eliza Webb Young, at least, is seeing these as both true, that there was an adoption and that there was a sexual relationship. So she's not treating the sexual relationship or the adoption story as a substitute for the sexual relationship. She's treating it as something that is true alongside it, right? So.
Love it. Okay, so the next phone call, I believe, is from a Derek, and I'm going to try to see if I can get this one to come onto the thing. Derek, are you there?
I am here. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. So go ahead, my friend.
Great. All right. Well, I was glad to have this show. When this book came out, I was surprised because I didn't feel like there was a lot of word about it, and I think it's really useful. So thank you for having this. I thought especially Compton's essay, I haven't been able to read all of it, including the essay you guys are talking about. But I think Compton's essay, analyzing the apologetic that Joseph Smith's marriages to women who were concurrently married were for time only, is a great takedown of that idea. But the reason I'm calling in is, Cheryl just brought up the idea, she brought up the word esoteric, and you guys were talking about that. And, I feel like sometimes in these circles, we use words like, this should be thought of as esoteric in order to soften what's really going on here. And in my mind, what's going on here is we're seeing a relationship move from a best case scenario. We're seeing a relationship move from a adopted daughter relationship to a sexual relationship. And I have a hard time viewing that as anything other than abuse. And I think that at the time that was viewed that way as well. And I just wonder if you guys would talk a little bit about the ethics of referring to these relationships in this day and age as anything other than abuse.
Derek, I want to leave it to the panel, but I've got to just say, I think that Oliver Cowdery shared your point of view.
I think Chauncey Webb shared your point of view too. Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead first?
I'd like
Chris?
to hear from Cheryl. I mean, Cheryl's the one that brought up the idea of how powerful it was to view these through the lens of esotericism. So Cheryl, maybe you could start.
Yes. Well, as I said, this is a disturbing. It is a disturbing thought to have, and I think that the women who lived in early Mormonism and in Nauvoo and in early Utah had a very tough row to hoe, and there was abuse. There was power dynamics that went on that were very difficult for us to resolve, especially in our day and age when we look at what was happening. And I know that when I was editing the book, I pushed back against Chris for being too critical in this area because I said that we have certain cultural ideas of these things, and we look at things in this way, and it might not have been quite as I don't know. I don't want to look back at the past with my own ideas. And Chris told me, I don't know, Chris, do you remember what you talked about your training in your PhD training about how we can look back at the past with our present eyes responsibly? Do you remember what you said to me about that?
Well, just that this is an area of dispute in the historical field, right? There are people who want to like suspend all modern judgments and just sort of like interpret the past through the lens of the people who lived it. And then there are people who say like, no, like we can't leave aside who we are. And the whole point of studying the past is to learn lessons about the present. And so like we have to bring our value judgments to the past. And like Stephen Prothero is the great champion of the latter position. And that's actually the position that I personally lean toward. In order to sort of like go along to get along, I've had to tone it down some because I think the dominant take in the historical field is more the first one, that you're supposed to suspend your value judgments. But I will say, like, people talk about, presentism, like you can't bring the values of the present to criticize the past. Well, I think actually there were a lot of people in the past at that time who had the exact same view that you have, Derek, that this was like hugely problematic. And like, if you want to argue that, like, you can certainly find lots of people of that time who took that attitude.
Right. But then again, you can take lots of people of the time who were wanting to push against these thoughts, like the Cochranites or the other religions who wanted to have communalism. And I think that's where Joseph Smith fell, and where a lot of the early Mormons did fall, where they were pushing against these societal restrictions. And so I tend to look at it that way. And I feel like a lot of our distaste towards polygamy comes from our cultural upbringing, whereas, you know, I certainly I was raised a little bit differently, where I don't have such a knee-jerk reaction against polygamy, so I tend to give it a little bit more grace, shall we say. But these are very, very important discussions to have. Is
absolutely
certainly true.
Before we get to Don, Don, before we get to you, I just want to share it with everybody. We had a phone call last night. We've had several phone calls in advance of this show. But we were talking about this issue. And of course, I have thoughts about it, morally, ethically. I'm sure everybody does to some degree or other. But then I also thought, well, it seems that my thoughts are probably the least important thing that I could say on the subject. Because what I think about it, I think pales in comparison to trying to get the history right.
Yeah.
And if we can get closer and closer to getting the history right, which I think all of you have done a great job of tonight with regards to Fanny Alger, then everybody gets to make up their own mind what it is that they think about it ethically.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, who cares what I think about it?
Well, so the great, like, I think what Cheryl was getting at is that there are like insider perspectives and outsider perspectives, right? And those are clear not only among historians, but also in the historical record. And I think to some extent, like, you don't need to bring your value judgments as a historian, because like all the value judgments are right there in the historical record already. And you can just report them. People like Chauncey Webb saying this or Joseph Smith saying that. And like you get the full range of possible interpretations there. And you can kind of leave it to your readers to like judge for themselves, you know, which ones they think they identify with. And I think it's actually, it is dangerous as a historian to identify too much with one side or the other, because it can like distort how you read the historical record, and you miss important things if you take sides too much and too early, you know? So sorry, Don, go ahead.
Yeah, I think these are complex questions and very important questions. And to the two views that Chris was putting forward earlier, right, in these sort of controversies among historians, should we bring our value judgments to the past? You know, should we regard that as just presentism and not judge the things people did in the past? Or should we come as fully who we are now and make those judgments? In a sense, my personal answer would be to do both, but in different ways, right? So I would want to try to judge the behavior of people in the past by the ethics that we have, because those are our ethics. Those are our understandings of right and wrong. I don't think those should simply be laid aside. And yet also, I think that we should not too harshly judge the people involved in those activities in the past. So I would distinguish, you're right, making ethical judgments about the behavior versus the people. As we look at ethical progress across time, you look at the past, you look at all the things that even fairly recently most people got wrong. All of us here are probably destined to be wrong on a number of things that future generations will look back at harshly. Those future generations will almost certainly be right in their ethical judgments about the things that we were blind to, but I hope that they will not be too harsh toward us as people, because all of us inevitably are to some extent products of our culture, our worldview, and so on. And so I don't have the slightest problem with looking back at things that happened in the past, including in early Mormonism, and making ethical judgments. And I think actually often that's something that I would say sometimes we need to do, frequently we need to do more of. I think that part of the reason why the issue of Mormon polygamy feels so unsafe to people. So for instance, there's a whole movement of sort of Joseph Smith polygamy skepticism, right? Where people think Joseph Smith did not practice polygamy. My personal view is that much of that comes from the fact that Mormon polygamy was not practiced in ways where people, the women involved had full informed consent going into the marriages. They in some cases, early on, the husbands, like Joseph Smith, went into the marriage without the first wife even knowing, or without the various plural wives knowing about the other plural wives, which means they had a lack of informed consent, right? In later Mormon polygamy, even if they knew that their husband was going into polygamy, they felt that they had to accept it, or they would lose their eternal family or their salvation. That's not in the fullest sense of voluntary free decision, right? There's a sense of, I have to do this. And so when people look at early Mormon polygamy and they feel uncomfortable with it, of course they feel uncomfortable with it. They should feel uncomfortable with it. And so I think then a lot of times people will want to deny that Joseph Smith taught and practiced polygamy, because if they accept that he did, then it might seem like they will be forced to accept non-consensual polygamy. So for instance, even though polygamy is no longer practiced by the LDS Church, practiced by fundamentalist groups still. In fact, there are more Mormon polygamists now than there were at the height of Latter-day Saint polygamy in the 19th century. But even if we confine ourselves just to talking about Latter-day Saint sealing practices allow that a woman who, let's say a woman who dies, or let's say a woman who has terminal cancer, or just thinks she might die before her husband, she knows that at least in theory, her husband could remarry after her passing, be sealed to another woman in the temple, and then put her in the position potentially of, entering into polygamy eternally that she didn't opt into. And so I think that part of why polygamy, historical Mormon polygamy, is so frightening to people, particularly to women, is that they see that there was a lack of informed consent, that the ethics were not done properly. And so then, so in some ways, I think we need to acknowledge the ethical problems more in order to sort of defuse these issues for people. Maybe if people hear, yes, Mormon polygamy was practiced, but we acknowledge these problems with it, then they might actually be able to better accept the history.
Can I just say two things, and then I'll throw the third phone call on, which is, one is that it's sort of binary to think, well, they handled it one way in that day, and then today we're using sort of presentism to misjudge it, which there were plenty of folks in Fanny Alger's day who were pointing to the issue being a scandalous, inappropriate relationship. So you don't need to sort of say like it's presentism, because there's plenty of people then that were making the same sort of judgment call. And then the other thing that I would simply want to say, and then we'll go to the third phone call, is that we're also dealing with a faith that claims that this voice comes from God, and hence it's not Joseph Smith's morality or the morality of the 1840s. On some level, what also has to be wrestled with is that this is God's morality imposed on Joseph Smith to carry out these things. And hence, one of the things I think everyone has to wrestle with is the consistency of God, or the ethics of God, or the morality of God, if the faith system really is true. And I think that leads down a whole nother set of questions. But let me pull up the third caller. This is Trisha. Trisha, are you there?
I am.
You're on Mormonism Live. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. This has been a great episode. I called once before a while ago. I'm actually a descendant of Fanny Alger, and thank you for saying Alger. So she's my great aunt. So this was kind of neat for me to hear, because this has been something that has been really hard for me to deal with, and seeing how she was treated and how she was manipulated. And the hardest part for me has been to see that her family, which is my direct grandparents, stayed in the church. So they took her, dropped her off in wherever she was with the other person that she married, and stayed in the church. And so that was really difficult for me to see. And something that's been kind of neat with this episode is to hear that maybe there's a different way to look at it, that they thought she was sealed to Joseph more as a daughter, and that maybe that was the reason why they were a little bit more accepting of what was going on. But I enjoyed what you guys were talking about, how there's many different ways to look at it, morally, and how some people could see that if God thought that that's what they were supposed to do, that maybe it was okay. So I guess my question for you guys is, what do you think, how do you think her family or her parents might have seen this as an okay situation, even as Fanny left the church?
Thank you, Tricia. I'll hang up and let them respond.
Yeah, so actually, I mean, like the last question was about like the use of the word esoteric, right? And Dawn and I actually would disagree as to the extent that like Joseph Smith was sincere in seeing these things as esoteric. I tend to see Joseph Smith as less sincere than Dawn does. So it's a testament that we can like collaborate on this paper, even having different views on that. But I think that like, I mean, for one thing, Joseph Smith is representing it as esoteric, but for another thing, Joseph Smith is not the only participant in these relationships, right? And so I think we can acknowledge that like esotericism is a factor in everybody, like the other participants' understandings of what's going on. And I think probably, you know, like that's how Fanny Alger arrives at reinterpreting the relationship from adoption to marriage, is that like she also has this esoteric view of what she's entered into, that it's a little more nebulous for her, you know, like the lines are not clearly drawn yet as to what this sealing ceremony is or represents. And I think that's probably true of the family as well. But yeah, like these are hard things to grapple with. And actually that's part of the reason that I've been so obsessed with Mormon history throughout my entire career, is trying to not only understand the psychology of Joseph Smith, but the psychology of all the people who went along with things that like I find really problematic. Like what was so compelling about all of this to these people? Obviously there was something. And I think that's part of what ideas like esotericism help us make sense of, is like, that's a big part of what was so compelling to people, is they felt like they were peeking into mysteries that were like too vast to understand. And in some ways, like the difficulty of those things and the faith crises that they encountered were like part of that sense of awe. Like you would feel like horror, but also like in the act of sort of like submitting to things that horrified you, it made you feel like you were breaking out of your like mindsets or your assumptions. And like transcending to some other like level of morality that you didn't know existed. And even though I find it problematic, like apparently a lot of people at the time found it ennobling and inspiring to have their moral frameworks shattered like that. And so I think that like, yeah, like it was traumatic. It was a traumatic experience for a lot of people. And yet, like somehow in the trauma, they made it meaningful for themselves, and it made them feel like they had like learned something and had a spiritual experience, you know?
So to the,
yeah,
go ahead. So to the point about esotericism, and then to Trisha's new question specifically. So the idea that these relationships were esoteric, I mean, that is in some ways, when we put that in the original paper, I think that might have in part been because things that I'm anticipating for a third paper, another paper, do deal more with esotericism specifically in relation to this. So I think I can unpack that more in future writing, what it meant for this to be esoteric, and that there is that is a concept that really helps us understand what was going on in the minds of the participants at the time. Chris and I have an interesting personal history regarding our views of Joseph Smith. We've been friends for something close to 20 years, maybe.
Yeah.
We were roommates at one time as well, and which was a lot of fun. And very late night conversations about Mormon stuff and philosophical questions and so on. But back years ago, I held the view pretty strongly that Joseph Smith was an opportunist, that he was religiously insincere, that he just had self-serving motives. Chris at that time saw Joseph Smith as religiously sincere. He and I have since swapped positions where I now see Joseph Smith as having been religiously sincere, and Chris sees him as having been more of an opportunist. So we both sort of repented of our previous views and changed places here. But but yes, very much on the basic issues of like what happened. Like in this case, we're often able to see eye to eye, even if we see some differing motivations behind what happened. To the caller's question about the family, it's first of all, it's wonderful to hear from you, a relative. I'm assuming you're a descendant of John Alger, but in any case, it's very interesting. We do know that we have a source where we're told that John Alger actually asked his sister Fanny Alger late in her life about her relationship with Joseph Smith, and she's reported to have said, "That is a matter entirely of my own, and I have nothing to communicate." And so she was hush-hush about it. In my sort of historian fantasies about, Fanny's spiritualist communications with the dead, I'm hoping that she communicated with Joseph Smith, and there's some great, communication there about their past relationship. But who knows? We are told that by the Webbs that the family, that Fanny's parents, even though they were living at the time of this sealing, adoptive sealing, they gave consent for it. They were very happy to have their daughter included in Joseph's family. This would also tend to be reflected, confirmed in the account by Fanny's cousin, Mosiah Hancock. Eliza Jane Webb said that Fanny's mother had always maintained that she was sealed to Joseph by Oliver Cowdery in 1835 or 36. She certainly seems to have had a positive frame on the relationship. So it seems like the family actually saw this very positively. In our paper, we do definitely take the position that there was like a polygamous relationship, right? That this becomes a polygamous relationship, that there's sexual intimacy here, right? And overwhelmingly, the sources say this. I could see that people could take the position. So like the Joseph Smith polygamy skeptics, for instance, could take the position, maybe it was just an adoption and there wasn't anything else that happened. I think that it would be difficult to explain the other sources in that case, or why Fanny was kicked out of the home and so on.
They'll find a way, believe me, Don.
But it might be possible for people to use this new research to say, oh, there was an adoption, wonderful, beautiful, and that was it, right? There certainly seem from the bulk of the sources to have been more than that. But I do think that the family, in any case, saw this as a positive connection with Joseph Smith.
Yeah, let me bring Cheryl back in here for just a second and ask you, since you're the only woman on the panel, does a woman, or anybody else for that matter, does a woman have to keep something secret if nothing happened?
Wait, I don't understand what you're saying.
It's a tacit admission, what she says to her brother.
Oh,
right?
oh, okay. Yes, no, something definitely happened. Yeah. No, I think secrecy was a huge part of all of this, and so we behave differently when we're keeping a secret. I mean, that's just honestly what happens. And I want to just say at the end here that I really appreciate Chris and Don, and we don't do this to. We actually have difficulty doing this kinds of things where we're not looked at, we're not trying to justify anything in the church. And I mean, we're not trying to hide anything, and we're not being dishonest about anything. We just want to find out what the truth was, and we want to understand the past, which is very difficult to do, and especially in this area of Mormon polygamy, it's very difficult to understand. And so we appreciate any other views that come forth. And so we're going to really want to have pushback on these things. And if people have other ideas, we love to hear this. And especially if they're based on documentation, that's, you know, what we're all about. And we have in the past changed our mind on many things. Like all three of us have known each other for quite a long time. And we've changed our minds quite frequently because of new evidence that comes up. And I think this chapter is an example of that, of changing your mind because you're looking at documentation in new ways. So I hope that people will jump on this bandwagon of looking at things and becoming part of, you know, a group that will look at things together rather than two separate, you know, competing factions. We have too much of that in our country. So we need to come together, and we need to say, well, what, you know, look at what are my ideas on this document. Well, here's my ideas on this document, and let's discuss them rather than tell each other that we're horrible people for thinking the way we do. You know, we're sincere, and we believe that you're sincere as well. So let's be better.
Amen. Thank you, Cheryl, so much. So I mentioned a little while ago how Chris and I have traded positions on our basic view of Joseph Smith and his motivations, right? Like all of us here, every one of us in this conversation has changed their minds substantially, right, about Joseph Smith across time. I've changed my mind in multiple directions even, right? So I initially saw Joseph Smith as very sincere, came to see him as a sort of pious fraud, then an opportunist, and came to see him as sincere, right? I see him as a very complex person, but I see a lot of evidence for his sincerity. This, as Cheryl said, this paper itself is an example of coming to see something in a very different light. I mean, before the chronology research, and then it's unfolding into the adoption idea, right? Like I never considered that Fanny Alger may have been adoptively sealed to Joseph Smith. That was initially kind of a mind blower, right? And so there we have, as Cheryl has talked about elsewhere, we have a sort of conventional narrative about the origins of Mormon polygamy. And she has talked about, well, we need to challenge that. And in my own work, I mean, that's something that I am trying to do, right? Like, for instance, the order of the wives in Nauvoo is something that I'm working on a lot in ways that may sound like a small thing. It actually has very large implications, right? And so I think we do need, to some extent, a new origin story about Mormon polygamy. I don't see that going anywhere near as far as the Joseph Smith polygamy skeptics would say, because I think that there is a very well-grounded body of data that scholars are drawing on. But please, let's have different vantage points. Please, let's have a conversation. Please, let's talk about, as we talked about earlier, not only what happened, but also the ethics of it. I think that I will lay out in future writings and probably podcasts how I see there's definite indication, even direct statements, that Joseph Smith himself saw that he had made ethical mistakes in his polygamy, that he was trying to improve the ethics of biblical polygamy, and that he saw, the D&C 132 actually says, you know, he had sins, quote unquote, I think that's verse 50, transgressions, I think that's verse 60, trespasses against Emma, I think that's verse 56, and so on. And D&C 132, of course, has its own set of problems, right? So we need to talk, be open to differing models, change our model, be open to acknowledging the ethical problems of the things that we're studying, so that then people maybe can gain new insight and also feel safe talking about these things, knowing that that people are not trying to force on them some sort of eternal relationship that they would detest or something like that.
I'll
Thank
just
you,
tack
Bill.
on really quick. I mentioned earlier that I think it's valid to bring moral judgments to historical work. But the way that I see the order of operations is first you bring the facts, second you
Right.
bring empathy, and then
Right.
third you bring your moral judgments. So you should not be bringing
Yes.
in the moral judgments until you have the facts lined up and you
Right.
understand exactly what all the people in the time and place were thinking about what they were doing, how they understood what they were doing.
Right.
Then you bring your moral
Right.
judgments. And
Yes.
so I think we're trying to
And
do 1 and 2
Yes.
here. I invite all of you to do number 3.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
But also, don't ever forget like how much people really adored Joseph Smith and loved him, and that the Algers were saying that they considered it a great honor that Fanny
Right.
was sealed to
Yes.
Joseph Smith. And so, I mean,
Yes.
I feel that that's very important in getting at what was happening in early Mormonism, is to see that the great love these people had for Joseph, the charisma that he had, and the religious insights that he was giving them and what he was bringing to their lives. That's very important to also look at.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't think
Yes.
there can be a lot of doubt that he had a lot of charisma, Joseph Smith,
You did.
For sure.
and continues
And-
today.
Yeah. And I love what Chris was saying about and agree completely about the order of operations, as he put it, which is a great way of putting it, like in mathematics, right? So first we figure out what happened. So sometimes I think people make the mistake of bringing the moral judgments before they really understand what happened, or before they understand what the people thought they were doing, right? And that can lead to problems in different ways. And one is we might make moral judgments that are actually moral judgments of things that didn't actually happen, right? If we haven't gotten our facts straight. But then also, if we bring the moral judgments first, we may end up being tempted to say, well, so-and-so could never have done this because it was morally wrong, right? And that would be a different sort of error, right? So that I think the order of operations there is very important. But I think it's important that each of those operations is carried out. We are ethical beings as human beings. We do need to make moral judgments on things. That's temporarily bracketing moral judgments to try to understand what happened and empathize does not mean that we don't bring in moral judgments at all. We should.
That's how you learn.
Yeah.
Okay,
And so
very
there,
good.
of course, there's the great old saying, classic saying that people know, to the effect that if we don't know, those who don't know the past are condemned to repeat it, right? And I would say that applies perhaps particularly to moral errors of the past.
Yeah.
We should be identifying moral errors of the past so that we can avoid falling into those same traps, so we can improve on them.
Right. There's the other saying that the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. But was it Carl Jung who said, of course, he said it in German, probably, and better than I, but I think he said, thinking is hard work. That's why most people just judge.
I like
Wow.
that.
And with that, we'll
Wow.
close tonight with Carl
Well,
Jung and Santayana.
hold
And if
on
you
one
want to
second.
improve on it, okay, you can have the last.
One second. I don't usually do this, but my father-in-law is actually a big fan of Mormonism Live.
He's good.
So I'm going to give a shout out to Barry Height, and of course to my adorable wife Jasmine.
Barry Height.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's Jasmine's your adorable wife.
Yes, indeed.
So this is her dad.
Yes, that's her dad.
Okay, very, very good. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here tonight. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for joining us tonight at Mormonism Live. Please join us. First of all, please get that book. What was it? What's it called? Secret Garden? Is that what it was, Cheryl?
Secret covenants, or as some would
covenants.
say, sacred covenants.
Yes. Let's get it straight. Yes, Secret Covenants, new insights on early Mormon polygamy. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you, audience. Please join us next week at 6:20 p.m. for the next episode of Mormonism Live. Good night, everybody.